Welcome to the Neutral Podcast, where we discuss paving the way to a sustainable tomorrow. I'm Nate Helbach, your host, founder, and CEO of the Neutral Project, a sustainable real estate development company. Join us each week as we host world-renowned guests and explore dynamic landscapes of real estate development, alternative investing, sustainability, forestry, urbanism, and new cutting-edge carbon-neutral construction materials that are shaping the cities of tomorrow. Welcome back to the Neutral Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Cara Eckholm, who is the founder of Eckholm Studios, an advisory firm that works with governments and startups to accelerate the deployment of climate technology. She also founded and leads the Pilot Policy Studio at Cornell Tech, a program supported by Sloan Foundation to match STEM academics with New York City government agencies to help decarbonize the built environment. In 2023, Cara was the lead author of Pilot New York City, a comprehensive plan co-authored with the City of New York to reinvent how the city pilots, procures, and changes policy to accelerate the deployment of climate technology. In 2022, Cara served on the New York Governor and Mayor's new New York expert panel, which we're going to talk about today, and tasked with reinvigorating the region's economy coming out of COVID-19. Welcome, Cara. Thanks for coming on to the show. Excited to have this discussion today. Maybe we could just start off with a little background on yourself and kind of what got you interested into rebuilding cities.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm from New York originally, fourth generation, but I grew up in Beijing in the 1990s, which was a really interesting period of growth for China. They built a lot of buildings, especially as Beijing was prepping to bid on the 2008 Olympics, which it eventually won. And so I think seeing the transformation of China's urban environments, you couldn't help but get interested in the subject. So that inspired me then in college to study urban policy and planning. I then moved to Copenhagen after I graduated, largely because I had learned through school that Denmark was the place where, which seemed to be attracting the most progressive thinkers with respect to sustainable densification. And so through being in Denmark, you sort of learn by osmosis about how to get bike lanes built, how to do net zero buildings, and that really then shaped the rest of my career.
Awesome. And after you were in Denmark, did you then start your career, or did you move and kind of continue your academic career in the Bay?
Yeah, so I actually, I was working in Copenhagen. So I started my my first job after college was as a consultant in Copenhagen, and I wasn't working directly in the built environment, or it was a span of different projects. Though actually, it was when I was a consultant, I was briefly a consultant for Velux, the roof window company, which is a very specific and niche product, but also it's a modular product. So I learned through that process more about sort of what the process actually looks like for specifying a product. And Velux as a company is pretty progressive with respect to the types of products they develop and the sustainability standards they hold themselves to. So that was kind of what really inspired me to go directly work in the field. So from being a consultant in Copenhagen, I then got a job at Sidewalk Labs, which is Google's urban technology incubator, and ended up sort of leading the day-to-day operations on what was an attempt to design and build a mass timber building factory. And so I ended up seeing the architecture, engineering, and construction team that was developing the prototypical buildings that factory was intended to produce.
Cool. Wow, that's impressive. And did Sidewalk Labs eventually build that factory?
Yeah. So Sidewalk Labs has a interesting and complicated legacy, but basically we spent 3 or 4 years developing the designs for the factory as well as prototypical buildings. And unfortunately, the efforts to capitalize the factory were ultimately culminated during the peak of COVID in March 2020. And also there's been some shifts in Alphabet's priorities. So the factory didn't end up happening, but I think with respect to the building designs that we created for the factory to eventually be able to produce, those actually have been utilized quite extensively. So basically, the approach that we took was, let's design what a prototypical mid to high rise mass timber building looks like. Let's disseminate our research widely, and that was partly with the intention of getting future orders for the factory. And we did that work in collaboration with Gensler, and this was back in 2017 through 2020, back when the mass timber movement was still pretty nascent. And so today, Gensler and other architects have designed buildings that are quite similar to those that we were producing initial prototypical models for. So I've been really pleasantly and happily surprised. I wrote a blog post about the work, and at this point it's had like 50,000 reads, and I still get contacts about it pretty regularly. So I think that's I think it also shows just sort of like the mass timber industry maturing a lot, such that people don't really need the baseline R&D anymore, but it's kind of like a baseline if you're trying to get up to speed.
Yeah, definitely very useful for kind of moving the industry along, and also useful for those who maybe aren't super familiar with the material or the designing material. So after Sidewalk Labs, where did you go next?
Yeah, so when COVID hit in March of 2020, I made the decision to go to business school just because it seemed like the world was shut down and I might as well use the time to do something productive. So I actually kept working at Sidewalk Labs part-time, and then was at Stanford for business school on the West Coast. And while I was there, I started doing some venture investing, really with focus on real estate technology. Ended up working with Zig Capital, which is a venture fund specifically focused on real estate technology. And they had led the seed round into a company called Neighbor, that was kind of variant of an attempt to deliver, again, mid to high rise mass timber buildings, and ended up joining them to try to stand up a couple of mass timber building projects in San Jose, a city in the Bay Area, which has a lot of opportunity for densification and has, importantly, the right politics to make densification happen.
That's awesome. And were you able to do a lot of work on that, kind of the same ideas that you were working on with Sidewalk Labs of the mass timber elements and design, and translate those to that design for the San Jose Tower?
Yeah, and I wasn't at Neighbor. I was not actually managing the design in any direct capacity, but I think really what changed relative to when I was at Sidewalk Labs was at Sidewalk there weren't many examples of high-rise mass timber buildings that had actually been not just delivered, but even fully designed. And so what we were doing at Sidewalk Labs is really foundational. If one were to construct a 35-story timber building, how would one go about doing it? So it was sort of proof of concept, whereas by the time Neighbor came around, there were examples of completed projects for Neighbor to emulate. And so I think, definitely mass timber and, the use of new timber materials has been a through line throughout my career. But what's changed is that the industry has grown tremendously during the time that I've been involved.
Yeah. It's kind of a cool iteration that you got to see, before your eyes, from this very kind of nuanced material all the way to, I mean, I don't want to say it's common practice to use mass timber today, but I think it'll eventually get there.
Yeah, for sure. And the regulation has changed a lot in the time that I've worked in the field.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you think about it, in 2020, we didn't really have 2021 IBC, where we had a whole new section of code published for Type 4. So
100%. And that was actually a lot of at Sidewalk Labs. We hadn't intended to get involved directly in policy, but what ended up happening was for this factory business, we were trying to find clients to deliver projects for, and, high-rise mass timber buildings were not allowed in the United States. And so we ended up practically actually getting very involved in discussions with the IBC about the 2021 code update, as well as directly in conversations with municipalities where their fire departments were receptive to considering mass timber and helping local building departments navigate and get first projects approved.
Sweet. So after the Bay Area kind of stint, I know you have now since moved back to New York. So how did you get back to New York?
Yeah, so there's a couple different drivers of that. Neighbor was actually located in New York, or split between New York City and California. But one of the other main reasons that I wanted to come back here is New York's my hometown, and also there's been a tremendous amount of momentum coming out of COVID to kind of reshape what the future of the city looks like. And so my former boss at Sidewalk Labs, Dan Dockroff, who used to be the deputy mayor of New York, sort of gave me the opportunity to serve on what was called the New New York panel, which was an effort by the governor and the mayor to create a plan to revitalize New York's central business districts coming out of the pandemic. And so I served on that panel, and the results of its work were published at the end of 2022, and it's a comprehensive vision for the future of New York City's downtowns, which spans everything from building more housing to congestion pricing in the Manhattan core to rethinking how the city pilots new technology.
Yeah, and I know we're going to get into the pilot New York that you kind of focused on in a second, but before we get there, you wrote, I think, a great opinion piece in the New York Times called Will Ambitious Plans for New York Get Crushed in Albany? So I guess my first question is, did they get crushed?
Unfortunately, yes. But the fight continues. The fight continues. Yeah, I mean, it's, housing politics in the U.S. have been really fractured for many years. Unfortunately, New York lags even the Bay Area now with respect to production of new housing. And in New York City's case, a number of the provisions around what New York City can build are actually set by the state, which is a anachronistic anomaly that was a function of the 1961 zoning code reforms, where the concern at the time was that vertical slums were going to be constructed in urban centers and that the state needed to play a more proactive role in deterring that. Of course, today, when we think about high-rise buildings, we do not think about vertical slums. And there is a desperate need for more mid to high-rise construction in not just New York City, but cities across the United States. Unfortunately, there is a very well-organized opposition to building more housing in urban downtowns. And that group has been very mobilized and vocal in New York State.
And that law that you were referring to, is that the multiple dwelling law that the state has?
Yeah, so the multiple dwelling law effectively precludes you from exceeding a 12 floor area ratio cap. And so that limits what developers can deliver in the city of New York. And actually, there's some really iconic buildings in New York that exceed that cap, but they were constructed before 1961. So I think it's an interesting, when people think, oh no, high rise, they think of like the worst possible example of high rise, like, an unattractive building that is full of luxury condos. And I think reframing the narrative around actually high rise can mean net zero, as you guys are trying to deliver. And it can mean something that is aesthetically pleasing and adds to the neighborhood, is a really important part of changing the discourse in the housing debate.
Yeah. Yeah. My understanding after reading your opinion piece was that this would also modify and allow for the office to residential kind of conversion that I feel like is such a big buzzword right now that the industry is talking about.
Yeah, for sure. So the opinion piece I wrote, there was multiple aspects to what was called the governor's housing compact that were all kind of grouped together. And so unfortunately that meant that they all died together as well. But as I said, the fight's going to continue into this legislative session. And I remain cautiously optimistic that both the city and the state will find new ways to produce more housing. But another issue that has been, I wouldn't say it's been as contentious as the modification of the 12 FAR cap, is with office to residential conversion, where to allow those conversions to occur and what type of financial incentives are delivered to developers to make sure those projects pencil. And then coupled with that is the question of what allocation should there be for affordable housing in any project that does convert.
Interesting. Yeah, I know this is such like a big buzzword right now, and we have done a few studies at the Neutral Project to do some office to residential, and it's crazy to kind of see how many buildings actually don't really work to do it. And we actually even had gone so far at this one project to hire a structural engineer, and this was in the Bay Area actually, in Oakland, and he had said that he had done like, I think it was 1,500 studies for different developers over the last year, of like, could we convert this to an office building? And almost all of them were in California. So this is specific to California.
Yeah.
But he had said that it was less than 20% of those actually were eligible for conversions based on the structure without having to do these like huge structural upgrades because of either the buildings being so antiquated that they needed to be updated to new codes to allow for a new use. Or they just were kind of old office buildings that were, they had lacked maintenance for the last 50 to 100 years.
I think to kind of resolve that question, so interestingly, the city of Calgary in Canada has been, from my perspective, the most proactive in setting up a real office to residential conversion program that's been pretty successful at delivering projects. So what they basically did is actually working with the same folks at Gensler who I had managed at Sidewalk Labs. They basically created an algorithm to determine, based on CoStar data, whether a building was likely a good conversion candidate or not, and then looked at the economics of a sample of 10 representative projects, then figured out, okay, so what amount of subsidy would we have to grant in order to get these projects to pencil? I think they ultimately determined that about a third of their building stock was convertible with a, I'd say, reasonable incentive. So we're not talking about, taking those types of projects you're describing that are just totally unworkable from a structural perspective and force fitting it. We're talking about projects that were close to working, with a bit of additional government support. And then they basically took that package to city council, had already identified the buildings they thought were good candidates, reached out to the developers to let them know, and got this package through to allow conversions to happen in their downtown. I think generally what we're going to see is cities that are proactive in identifying buildings that are good conversion candidates and structuring a clear pathway, which means both a regulatory pathway as well as a financial pathway to prompt those conversions to happen, are going to see a lot more conversion activity than cities that don't have that type of program.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Is that Steve Patner, I think is his last name?
Yeah.
At Gensler?
Painter. Yeah, exactly.
Painter, yeah.
Yeah,
I should actually have him on the podcast. That's a good idea.
He'd be great. He's the master expert and an office to residential conversion expert.
Yeah.
So
it's like two hot subjects. That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, getting back to your opinion piece, there's a few more questions I wanted to ask you. One was this idea, which isn't specifically New York City, but my understanding was it was more for the suburbs of New York.
Yeah.
And it would allow for additional units to be zoned on specific parcels. And it was, I think, called a housing compact. Could you tell us more about this?
Yeah. So not only would it allow for units to be built on parcels, it would actually mandate that if you are within, I don't remember the exact radius, but basically it's saying to the suburbs that if there's mass transit in your suburb, you should be focused on transit-oriented development. So that means low-rise buildings, we're talking like up to 6 stories around transit stations, which is something that, or is a development pattern that is extremely common in Europe, but is unfortunately not very common in the US still. And so the proposed solution was basically to set a threshold for, if you are a suburb that is on mass transit, we expect to see a certain amount of housing growth occur over the next, I don't remember the time, it was like 5 years or something like that. And if that doesn't happen, then the builder's remedy is what they call it, kicks in. And that basically means that you lose your ability as a municipality to determine which projects get approved. And the state says that you have to approve new projects. This is something that California has already done in response to its own housing crisis, where as a municipality, you retain the control to decide what gets approved. But if you're rejecting everything, then the state takes control. And so in New York City, the hope is that, municipalities would independently decide to approve new projects. But if that were to not happen, then transit-oriented development near transit-oriented development would be the sort of mandate coming down from the state.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's a very big incentive. I always think about, like, are you giving the carrot or the stick to some of these cities? And it's like, from the developer's perspective, you don't really have the ability to have any recourse. Like, if the neighborhood says, no, I don't like your project, you're probably not going to get approval, even though that project should be built there, or those units should be built there. Maybe not specifically that project, but the units need to be built. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have this kind of perpetual housing crisis. And so it seems like a good tool for the state to say, hey, approve this project, or we're going to do it for you. And I think it basically would just incentivize, the neighbors and the plan commissions and the city councils to have a little bit more expedience to their workflow. Because a lot of this stuff is like, it can be approved, but it's just, you need the neighborhood feedback, you need the plan commission feedback, you need city council, and it's like, that all takes a lot of time, especially when there's no real time constraint on any of these municipal authorities, but there is for developers. Yeah. So yeah, it seems very judicious, but it's unfortunate that it got shot down.
Well, so
I'm rooting for you, hopefully.
Ultimately, what happened is the state has pursued more of a carrot-based approach, which is better than nothing, right? So you can tax breaks for developing near transit in suburbs. But unfortunately, the experience in both New York and California has been absent a stick. There's almost no amount of money that can incentivize people to build in those areas, especially the wealthier suburbs for whom the money is not as meaningful. And so, I think the stick is going to be necessary at some point. Should we be focused on densifying peri-urban areas? And I personally believe that the densification of those areas is really important to seeing through equitable regional growth, and that there's a ton of examples, whether it be Paris, Barcelona, Copenhagen, of really high quality, low to mid-rise development on train stations in suburbs that are, like 20 minutes outside of the urban core, and that model is not only better for the city, but it's also better for the people actually living in those areas as well.
Yeah. My understanding from that housing compact was, it was, I think, within a half mile of a transportation authority station, there would have to be this regulation, which makes total sense to me, because it's like, if you're building either, mandated affordable units or just kind of naturally occurring affordable units, you want to be able to walk to the transport and go to work or go get your groceries. So it's like very pragmatic and logical, it seems, but sometimes politics gets in the way, unfortunately. Well, switching now to segment 3, to kind of talk a little bit more about what your focus work has been, which is the Pilot New York program. Could you just tell us a little bit more about this program and kind of what you've been focused on with it?
So to link it back to our earlier conversations, within this new New York plan, there was a lot of different components to it, spanning housing to transport, but there was one initiative called Initiative 31 that had the ambitious goal of making New York the global hub of urban innovation. After the new New York plan came out in 2022, I then started working with the city to develop a specific implementation plan for Initiative 31, and we called it Pilot New York City. The intention behind it is New York City continues to face a challenge of what we call pilot purgatory, which is basically pilot projects of new technologies occur, but then they don't end up actually scaling across the city. And that's for two different reasons. Either the pilots don't lead to government procurement orders, or the pilots don't inform modifications to government policy. So just to give you a specific example of each, on the policy side, we know that curbside electric vehicle charging is really expensive to do in New York City because of the permitting process regarding trenching. So that's an area where there's been a lot of pilots, And ideally, we'll see policy change to allow for that technology to proliferate. On the procurement side, there's a variety of programs in the transportation space, for example, using computer vision to automate ticketing processes where a pilot's done, and then ultimately to implement the technology, the government would need to buy it, and then also change policy to allow for automated ticketing. And so part of what we tried to do through our research was figure out what's not working about the existing procurement process that leads to pilots occurring and then the procurement not happening, and what can we propose that would solve that issue.
Interesting. So when I had just actually gotten back from a trip from New York, I guess that was this past summer, but when I was there, I was surprised to find that when I went in the metro, I could use Apple Pay now for getting into the metro. Is that a direct result of the pilot program?
No, so that's not the whole pilot New York City effort is it started last year. And so it really in response to, so one of the first things we did was document all the piloting programs that already exist in New York City. And we found that through the existing infrastructure, about 600 companies apply to pilot their products in New York City every year in the built environment. So we specifically focused on mobility, buildings, energy, and digital infrastructure, and about 50 pilots occur every year. So New York City, I think relative to other cities, has a really strong foundation in getting the pilots to happen in the first place. Where it's struggling is the conversion of the pilots to actual citywide deployment. And it's not just a New York City issue. Every other city we spoke to for this research also had the same challenge. And that is really what prompted, if you look at the report, we ended up meticulously documenting exactly how the municipal procurement process works and then proposing modifications to it in order to try to solve this challenge of the turnaround time between pilots and purchases. So I'm not sure the Omni system you're referring to, I think that was a MTA initiative. It's possible they started it as a pilot project, but that precedes the work that I've been doing.
Okay. Yeah, and the report that Cara is referencing we'll have in our show notes. So if people do want to dig in, they can definitely do that. And they'll just go to our website and click on the link and it'll be there. The question I have for you next about this was, how have you seen kind of this pilot program foster more innovation, and maybe not more innovation, but it seems like there's been kind of a lot of these companies that have come to New York City and said, hey, we have this cool idea to allow technology to make our lives easier or more efficient. And what has happened is New York's kind of just own political environment has kind of stopped that from happening or has lessened it. And so how have you seen kind of this pilot program, one or two of these cool kind of initiatives, and actually translate to a working kind of living technology that's used every day?
Yeah, so I mean, the program itself, and really the report that I wrote had a variety of different programs that are now all getting stood up. But to talk about in our research what we saw out of existing programs, some that are working really well, I think a really interesting kind of untold story is about the New York City Housing Authority. So called NYCHA, it houses 1 in 60 New Yorkers. A lot of people know it because unfortunately there was a question about whether it would go into federal receivership a few years ago. So it's been a challenge organization in many ways, but one area where it's actually been a national leader is with respect to procurement of climate technology and actually making new markets for climate technology. So just to talk through some of the programs that they're running, about 3 years ago, they ran what they called the Clean Heat for All Challenge. So basically it was a call to the market that they would be willing to purchase up to 30,000 units of heat pumps if someone could design a heat pump that worked in a cold weather climate, that was under a certain price point, and that could be installed in less than 1 day. And they chose to run that challenge in response to trying existing vendors in the market and finding that no one can meet those specifications. And through that challenge, they then got a bunch of responses, ended up giving out to awards for pilots, and then are going to be procuring off of the back of that. And I think it's a really interesting example. And one of the companies that got the initial contract is a San Francisco-based startup that this is their first major order their first major order was from the government. And after they got this order, they went on to raise their Series A financing round and have seen a lot of growth. And so it's a kind of counterintuitive, I think, for a lot of people, notion of like, what is government's role with respect to the creation of new technology? Should government choose to utilize its procurement powers for the purpose of modernizing its built environment, it can actually really meaningfully create new climate technology markets.
No, that's interesting to think about how that one order allowed this startup company to kind of go from their seed round, it sounds like, to their Series A. And so how is that, like, outside of this one company, how have you seen that kind of impact, and what is your kind of thesis moving forward of how could other municipalities do this and use kind of their procurement budget as this kind of startup? It's not really VC dollars, like they're not investing in these companies, but giving them orders is allowing these companies to have more validity to go out to VCs or to private equity to get additional funding. So how do you think more municipalities could kind of augment this with startups?
Yeah, and I think it's not just validity, it's actual revenue, right? And it's government being willing to be a first buyer when maybe the private market isn't ready. And I think what it does is solve, in climate tech, they call it the valley of death. So you reach a point where you've been subsidized by, in often case, it will be like the federal government through R&D grants. You then have an interesting new hardware product, but you don't have commercial customers yet. And you're debating, how can I set up my first factory? In order to set up a factory, you need orders. In order to get orders, you need to set up a factory. And so there's kind of this chicken and egg thing that happens, which tends to be the stage where a lot of climate technology companies die because of how capitally intensive setting up a factory is to produce, or even outsourcing to another factory. You still have to say, okay, here's the minimum ticket order that we're planning to order from you in the next year. And so I think, solving the valley of the death through government acting as a first buyer of green building technology is one of the most powerful roles that government can play. And in particular, on the procurement front, this notion of doing challenge-based procurement, where you say, we're trying to solve this problem, and if you can offer us a solution that meets these particular specifications, we will order from you. We will pre-commit to ordering from you. That type of arrangement creates a framework in which you prompt people to bring their innovations to you, and then you can run a competitive selection process. And so part of the push in the report, and this is ultimately the strategy that New York is pursuing, is instead of going from a dynamic of, 50, or in New York's case, 600 different startups approaching the city with various ideas, which is great as like a baseline, the city also needs to play a more proactive role in defining what its problems are, and then creating a legal framework to run these types of challenges where there is a prize at the end. And the prize is not just giving away free money, right? It's actually buying something that helps New York City residents. And I think any city in the US should be able to adopt that challenge-based procurement model.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, like, specifically in construction in Wisconsin, we have a lot of hard bidding where either local municipalities, schools, or the state will go out to all these different contracting firms and get hard bids. And then it's basically, they have to, like, state statute mandates them to take low bid as long as it's qualified. And it seems like, well, that's kind of maybe a good judicious thing to do if you're a taxpayer, because you're not having to pay more in taxes. But ultimately, it might be more efficient to do kind of this methodology, which allows for innovation, which, I mean, it doesn't have an immediate direct effect on cost, but it will probably have a direct effect on cost over the long term, because we're able to put more innovation into the space and have things maybe cost less or be more efficient. So yeah, it seems like it's just a new paradigm for municipalities.
I think the other aspect of this is, so typically government procurement, they look at the lowest cost qualified bidder, and how they define qualified heavily rewards a history of performance, which on the one hand is important, on the other hand means that contracts always go to legacy players. So the average government procurement usually only sees 2 to 3 responses, which is super low. And the types of companies that are set up to win government procurements are typically legacy institutions. This challenge-based procurement model, what it does is it says, instead of looking at your historical track record of delivery, what we're asking you to do as part of this procurement process is to pilot your technology in the field so we can see whether it works or not. We're not looking at the historical track record on paper. We're looking at a live prototype of whether your technology works for our city. And so I think really focusing on demos the same way sort of the norm has evolved in the tech world to do that is a core tenet of how we allow government to work more easily with earlier stage companies that might actually have ideas that are lower cost, not just in the long term, but also in the near term, but just today are not currently really equipped to compete with larger legacy players.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of democratizes the bidding process with local municipalities and state agencies. I know you've talked a little bit in the past, and we've had conversations about it in regards to kind of cooperative purchasing and this notion of multiple municipalities kind of coming together and coalescing into one for purchasing reasons. But how have you seen that maybe in your current work, or how would you plan on, maybe a few small Wisconsin municipalities being able to come together and buy, 50, 100 or 2,000 heat pumps?
Yeah. So I think, so there's cooperative purchasing among cities, and then there's what can the state do? So, if you're a city in Wisconsin, and I'm sure there's multiple cities in Wisconsin that have housing authorities, they can band together under, state law everywhere and place orders together through a cooperative purchasing agreement. So that's one way to aggregate your volume such that you get up to a point that you could run something like a challenge and have a lot of respondents. The other thing for states to consider is how can they play that coordinating function? So the other place that challenge-based procurement has really taken off is California. And in California, Gavin Newsom in 2019, right when he took office, issued an executive order to make challenge-based procurement the norm in technology purchasing for the state. And the first challenge they ran was focused on technology to detect early instances of wildfires. And they basically said to the market, anyone who can propose a good solution to do this, we don't know what the right answer is. It might be using satellite data, it might be using thermometers. Come propose your solution. We're going to trial a bunch of different options over the 2019 wildfire season, and then we're going to reward a contract to whoever develops the best solution for the state of California. And that was a sort of wildly successful endeavor that ended up seeing, I think it was 133 respondents. Again, contrast that to the 3 respondents you see on the average government RFP. And so they've now rolled challenge-based procurement out as the norm for purchasing across the state of California, which means it's also accessible to the cities. So I think, states and cities, and not just in the U.S., actually globally, like this is a model that now has a few proof points, whether it be California or the New York City Housing Authority, of it works. So I'm hoping it scales more broadly.
Yeah. It definitely augments creativity in the space. I know one of the other things we had discussed was about the Department of Defense and their procurement budget, which is massive. But how could they kind of use some of these ideas to assist in innovation? Yeah.
So, thinking again about sort of who has the money to influence the development of new technology sectors in the U.S., of which I'd say green buildings is a critical sector. The DoD has funds and also an interest in decarbonizing its building stock, which partly relates to the fact that many of its bases are in locations where energy access is challenging. So the DoD has an acute interest in figuring out scalable models of net zero buildings. I think as a country as well, we're starting to see the climate crisis as a question of national security. So it's not just about bases abroad, but also more broadly, unless we figure out how to rapidly adapt to and mitigate future emissions, all of our security domestically is jeopardized. And so the DoD actually has a solicitation out now for a team to develop a prototypical net zero building that's coming from the Defense Innovation Unit, which is the part of the DoD that runs innovation programs and ultimately utilizes a similar challenge-based procurement mechanism to what California and New York City are adopting.
Well, yeah, I don't think a lot of people think about it, but I guess the DoD is housing a ton of people on all these different bases, so it is in their best interest to have this industry progress and be more towards a carbon neutral state.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a fourth of federal real estate. So just taking a step back, the U.S. government is the single largest consumer of energy in the United States. A fourth of the real estate is owned and operated by the DoD. So that is a massive opportunity for decarbonization. And I think it's fantastic that everyone's interests have aligned around making that a priority.
Yeah, it's definitely a big step. Transitioning to our last segment, because I know we're coming up here on time, I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of your current work and what you're doing today. And I know one of the initiatives is with Eckholm Studios, which kind of helps cities implement some of these ideas. But maybe you could just give us a little bit more background on what your thoughts are and kind of what your initiative is there.
Yeah, so I mean, in response to writing the pilot New York City report, I've started getting a lot of inbounds from both startups as well as governments that are interested in figuring out how to accelerate the deployment of climate technology. So I've had the privilege since then of working with some of those. On the startup side, an example is a company called Voodoo, who are probably relevant to your audience in that it's a new materials company that essentially removes the lignin found in wood and replaces it with the bio-based resin, which has the effect of transforming wood into a material that either can resemble glass, leather, or steel, depending on the chemical composition. The reason I find it really interesting is Voodoo's process can also work on wood species that are not typically used in the construction industry because they're too low grade. And we have an issue now because of climate change where a third of timber species are facing extinction. And so we are going to need to figure out how to utilize that timber stock. Otherwise, you'll have forests where there's trees that are rotting and actually create a forestry ecosystem risk and perpetuate the risk associated with wildfire. And so I think Voodoo's process creates a really interesting opportunity to get trees out of the forest before they rot and then put them to use in the built environment. And through the process of bioengineering, actually make a material that allows for the application of timber, or in this case, a timber variant, they call it augmented wood, that can be utilized in parts of the building where timber typically can't go, because with respect to their steel product, at least it's of a comparable strength to steel through the bioengineering process. So that's part of what I've been working on. And then also on the government side, I've been working with entities like the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, which is responsible for R&D spending to help decarbonize New York's economy, and they're actually one of the entities behind the NYCHA procurement mechanism I was describing at the beginning of the podcast. So they've been helping structure some of these challenges. So that's sort of what I've been up to with the consulting side. And then separately at Cornell Tech, where I'm a visiting fellow, I helped found and lead a program we're calling the Pilot Policy Studio, which is basically a matchmaking program between academics with a STEM background and New York City government agencies to help perform technical diligence on pilot projects and then make policy recommendations so that things like curbside electric vehicle charging can scale more broadly across the city of New York.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot that you're working on. That's awesome.
It's a lot, yeah. It's been fun, but it's been a lot, yeah.
With Voodoo, are they producing and manufacturing yet, or are they kind of still in the R&D stage?
Yeah, no, they're so they outsource their manufacturing, but they have they have a facility and they have an outsourced contractor, and they're delivering in Europe already.
Oh wow, that's cool. Yeah.
They've been around since 2017, so they're older than many of the new materials companies.
Yeah, are they based in Europe or are they based in the States?
Yeah, they're based in Paris.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I'd love to talk to them because I wonder if we could maybe do a collaboration for one of our buildings and try to figure out how we can work with them.
Yeah, for sure. I think, in terms of the level of readiness, so there's, as I was saying, 3 different product lines, glass replacement, steel replacement, and leather replacement. The leather and glass replacement business lines are often running with customers in the fashion and auto industry, respectively. And then the steel replacement product That one's a little bit earlier, but they are doing an initial project in Switzerland focused on siding. So it's not the full structural application, but really the question is how quickly the product from a structural perspective can get through US fire testing. And I think the path is much more straightforward with respect to the glass replacement. So that's where the company's starting to focus in the US. But the structural product should get there in the next couple of years with respect to the fire testing.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that's always a big hurdle to get over in the US, all the testing.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you coming onto the podcast, and I enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
If people want to find you, should we just send them to the Eckholm Studios website?
Yeah, I think either my LinkedIn or caraeckholm.com is where I need to update it. It's a little bit outdated, but I'm in the process of doing that now. So either one of them is great.
Okay. Yeah. And we'll add that also to the show notes so people can just click the link and go there.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Yeah. Really appreciate you joining, and I really like the conversation. So thanks for coming on to the podcast.
Yeah. Thanks for doing it. Talk to you later.
Okay. Awesome. At the Neutral Project, we're not just building structures. We're building a legacy of sustainability, helping align your investments with a sustainable future. We'd like to thank you for being part of this conversation. For more information and to stay up to date on how we're reshaping the future through environmentally conscious development, visit our social media accounts or our website at theneutralproject.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the Neutral Podcast.